laws.
Hi, I'm Rob Akins. I'm the director of the Professional Development Core for the Delaware CTR, and I have had some other idea mechanisms as well. But I wanted to talk a little bit about responsible authorship today. It's a big topic area, and we're only going to cover a little bit of it. And mostly what we're going to cover is summarized by the ICMJE, and we're going to talk about why authorship matters, who is an author, and what are some non-author contributions that go as acknowledgments and what that really means. The two sources that I'm using are from the ICMJE and then the Office of Research Integrity at the Human Health Services.gov. So one quick thing before we talk about authorship, I just want to make a quick note about plagiarism. And there's been, the ORI, the Office of Research Integrity, NIH, tracks these things. It's not a good idea to get caught plagiarizing. This Terry Magnuson case, and his name is published on the website, and it's in the Federal Register. This is just in 2022, had plagiarized text in a grant. And that's the thing I want to make sure that people remain very cognizant of, especially when you're working in teams and people are kind of sending chunks and information. And early on in drafts, sometimes text is taken over just as placeholder, and you have to make sure that you go through and re-edit through. So Terry plagiarized text in an R01 grant that was submitted in 2021 and was caught doing that. We can go back during the Q&A, we can talk more about this, but the publishers for journal articles and components of the federal government and granting agencies in general and foundations have much more sophisticated mechanisms for checking and comparing and using kind of AI to find out places where chunks of text have come from other places. And you just be wary of it. And again, especially in the context you have multiple people, the PI is the one that submits it, and the institution that the PI represents submits it at the end. So they're the ones that are that will end up getting caught if there's a problem with plagiarism. But we really want to talk about why authorship matters in sort of how you decide who is an author. And authorship is important, as we all know, because it confers credit to the named people who are listed there. It has significant academic, social, and financial implications if you're an author on an especially influential, or really on any article itself. And it indicates responsibility and accountability for the information that's presented. So for those reasons, this is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which is a huge group. And this is the group that even the NIH and the Office of Research Integrity point to as the standard or the gold standard for determination of authorship. So an author, according to ICMJE, has made a substantial contribution to the conception or design of the work. And it's these four criteria, right? And you should fit into all of these, or at least a bulk of these, to consider yourself an author. But there's a substantial contribution to the design, the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data, right? So that's the research work itself. That you're also part of the drafting and revising of the important parts of the paper and intellectual content. That you have final approval on the version that's to be published. That's implicit in most journals now, if you're an author listed. And that you agree to be accountable for all aspects. So even if you're, a 6-author paper and you're in the middle and you really did the work for one of the figures, and you're responsible for the whole thing if you're listed as an author, and that you agree to do that. A lot of publishers now have all authors sign this agreement and that they understand that responsibility. The way this is set up, it's not meant to be a way to, just as an example of how this can be misused, and I'm sorry to sort of take a negative slant on this, but this is not meant to be a way to say keep a student off a paper because they did all of number one, all of the contributions, they designed it, did all the work. But if you don't allow them to work on the draft and they don't see the final paper, you're not supposed to use this, or you shouldn't use this as a way to exclude them, saying, well, you're not an author because you didn't write it. It's meant to encourage people to make sure that they participate in all four of these levels. And that idea that you wouldn't give credit to a student or someone who participated at that level and they made a substantial contribution is a different research integrity issue. So those are the four areas. Those are also the areas that the NIH recognizes in most other places. There are significant non-author contributions, but things that count as being a non-author but not necessarily an author is general supervision. There are cases where I supervise people in my group that I really wasn't, they're working on it, they're doing it, I'm not an author, just because I was supervising what they were working on broadly, not specifically the study. I'm not an author. They can acknowledge me, and in fact, this is an area that's often acknowledged for the support and sort of sponsorship. Administrative support, just kind of moving things around, ordering, that kind of thing. That doesn't mean you should acknowledge that kind of effort. If it can't be done, if the paper couldn't be done without that support, you should acknowledge it. But things like writing assistance, technical editing, language editing, and proofreading, I think those categories are all pretty straightforward. There's some specific examples on the ICMJE web pages, and the link, I'll send these to Aaron as soon as I can figure out how from here. But things like clinical investigators or participating investigators, those are categories where you can group people together. And if you're on an IRB approved study, and there's a number of clinicians, but the specific work, it's a big study, the specific work in paper didn't include them per se, but they were helpful in identifying patients, for example. They can be listed as clinical investigators or participating investigators. And then some descriptors that are recommended or specifically called out by ICMJE are served as scientific advisor. Again, it doesn't make you an author just because you advised. That you critically reviews the proposal, that you helped collect data, that you provided and cared for study patients. This in the hospital setting, this is one that's an interesting one to make sure you talk to clinicians who are participating early on and include them if they want to be included as an author, but that requires them participating at a level of intellectual contribution that they may or may not be interested in doing. And then it participated in writing or technical editing of the manuscript, but not the components of the manuscript that comprise the intellectual contribution to the literature. So, an author is, you know it when you see it. People working in the field, there are lots of cases, especially as you go further back in the literature, where, say, department chairs in particular cultures and particular fields of endeavor and particular institutions, the department chair was always included, right? But now the current suggestion is, well, they're either an advisor or a supervisor or sponsor, but if they didn't contribute intellectually to the genesis of the project, the execution of it, and the writing of the manuscript, then they shouldn't be considered an author. All right, so these are from the ORI website. So I'm just going to go through some questions to ask yourself, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. So there are different cultures in different fields. So you should be aware of what the accepted criteria for authorship are in your field of research, and look at the journals that you're publishing in. The instructions for authors will have some information, often pointing back to those standards that I just talked about. If there are none, if your field is new or you're sort of trying to combine a multidisciplinary, what should they be? What should those contributions be? Should researchers be allowed to omit some details from method sections of their publications until they have time to patent their methods? So this goes more specifically to what the authors do and potential conduct that could be considered questionable if not adequately disclosed. What do you do if a journal has accepted a publication, would not let the publisher, you're now an author, but if the journal that accepted it won't let you publish the method or result, in as much detail as you feel is necessary. So now this goes to an author's responsibility. If the journal says, well, I've had this, so I'll use a specific example. We submitted to a particular journal that I won't name, and I think there were 6 authors based on the ICMJE guidelines. The journal had a rule that the editor-in-chief enforced that no more than 5 authors. So we argued back and forth, and he wouldn't budge, saying, well, one of these people has to come off. So we went to another journal. So that's a specific example having to do with authorship, but there are other examples where the author who's responsible for the work is, in conjunction with the publisher or the journal, asked to alter the manuscript in a way that they feel doesn't adequately or properly represent what was done. Since the author is the one responsible for that conduct, they have to have that conversation with the editor. And how do you do that, and what do you do? So what do you do if there's an undeserving author in a position of some authority demands authorship? That still happens on a fairly routine basis, unfortunately. And what factors should be considered when making a decision to publish the results of a study in one article versus several articles? There's, the responsible conduct of research sort of dictates, and the ethics dictate that one body of work should be published as one thing. There's lots of different reasons why an individual might want to split a work down into what used to be referred to, or probably still is, as the least publishable unit. So if you have something that's a major contribution, the ethical idea is to publish it as one paper. What really happens, or what the pressure is on authors, is to split it. If it can be done in 5, do it in 5. But from the government's perspective, the funder's perspective, and really the community's perspective, that's overrepresenting the strength of the work. There's not, now 5 papers on one thing. There's one thing that's been split into 5 papers that really should be unified. But that is a really complex issue to talk about. And there's lots of drivers, and there's no one right answer to most of these questions. The big sort of overarching one where we started is who's an author on the work that's going forward. And I'll stop with this final thought. The time to discuss that is when you're starting, when you're putting the team together and talking about who's going to be responsible for what, and being very clear with individuals who are working on the research team that they will or will not be authors depending on these specific benchmarks or these specific, pieces that have to come together, and their thorough intellectual engagement in the article itself, drafting it, editing it, and finally approving it. So those things should happen early on. It doesn't, research projects can be a hot mess of activity, and you're sort of finding things out along the way and deciding what you're going to publish. So it's not as easy as it sounds, I know. But the more clarity you can have, the better on who represents an author. So I hope this is helpful, and I would be happy to engage in any further discussion or answer any questions. But thank you very much.